You see, my friends, there comes a particular moment in the life of a sensitive soul when the world stops being a battlefield between me and them, between the empath and the narcissist, and becomes instead a vast symbolic mirror reflecting what was once hidden deep beneath the surface of consciousness. And what I wish to explore with you today is not merely the dynamic between two personalities, nor the familiar dance of attraction and repulsion that binds the empath to those who cannot truly see them. No, what I wish to touch is the deeper, more ancient pulse beneath that phenomenon. The pulse that speaks through dreams, through shadows, through the invisible language of the psyche that knows long before the conscious mind ever realizes. For many empaths, the year does not simply turn as the calendar dictates. There are years that mark an inner threshold, years that demand an encounter with the very wound that shaped their identity. And 2026, symbolically and psychologically, marks such a threshold, a year when the unconscious rises like a tide, not to drown, but to reveal. It is the year when the empath no longer sees the narcissist as an enemy or a curse, but as a reflection, a figure cast from the earliest chamber of childhood, where the first wound was carved, quietly, invisibly, beneath the developing sense of self. And you must understand this clearly: the narcissist in your life is never truly a stranger. They are an echo. They are the embodied return of something unresolved, something you survived without understanding, something the psyche buried. Because it had no language at the time, every empath thinks they simply attract narcissists. But that is a surface level observation. What truly happens is far more intricate, far more mythic. The wound calls back what created it. The psyche summons the unresolved story in order to finally complete it. But a story cannot complete itself until the protagonist understands they are inside it. This is why so many sensitive souls reach a breaking point, a turning point, not through external resistance, but through inner awakening. The moment you begin to see the narcissist not merely as a manipulator or a taker, but as the symbolic embodiment of the very parent who could not hold your emotional truth, the entire dynamic shifts. It shifts not because the narcissist changes, they rarely do, but because you fundamentally change your perception of what is happening to you. When a child grows in an environment where emotional attunement is absent, where the parent's gaze is cold or self-absorbed or unpredictable, the child learns to mold themselves, to contort their intuitive self into whatever shape keeps the peace, and that child becomes the adult empath who feels compelled to heal, understand, absorb, and forgive, not because they are pure saints, but because they were trained, sculpted, conditioned to survive through hyper-attunement. Their sensitivity was not merely a gift, it was a survival strategy. And so, the narcissist later in life plays the role of the unhealed parent with uncanny precision. The empath's old wound recognizes the familiar pattern, and this recognition is mistaken for destiny, or love, or chemistry. But what it truly is memory, not memory of facts, but memory of pain. The unconscious repeats what it cannot yet resolve, and this is why the year 2026 becomes crucial, because there is a collective energetic movement, a deep shift in human consciousness, where countless individuals, especially empaths, begin to awaken to the symbolic nature of their suffering. They begin to realize that the narcissist is not merely someone who drains them, but someone who reenacts the emotional conditions of their early life, someone who forces them to confront the very moment where their emotional needs were dismissed, minimized, or weaponized. When the empath finally sees this, truly sees it not intellectually, but with the clarity of the soul, everything changes. Their compassion no longer chains them to self-sacrifice. Their boundaries no longer feel like cruelty. They begin to reclaim the emotional space that was stolen from them long before they ever met the narcissist. And this reclamation ushers in a profound inner turning, a movement from unconscious repetition to conscious authorship. But to reach this point, one must look into the darkness without fear. One must enter the shadowed forest of their own psyche and listen to the voices long buried. Perhaps you remember dreams from childhood, dreams where you stood in a room filled with mirrors but could not find your reflection. Or dreams where a figure chased you, not with violence, but with a terrible familiarity. These dreams were the psyche's early attempts to communicate the truth that the self you had become was not the self you were born to be. That you were living through a fragmented identity, one shaped entirely by the emotional climate of your upbringing. And so the empath grows into a healer of others, not because they choose to, but because this is how they learned to exist. They identify the needs of others before their own. They sense the unspoken tensions in a room. They interpret the emotional wounds of others with instinctive precision, but what they rarely see is themselves. They rarely notice that in tending to everyone else's wounds, they avoid the one wound they fear will consume them. The narcissist, paradoxically, becomes the bearer of that buried wound. Their presence triggers the original pain, the old helplessness, the silent yearning for acknowledgement that was never granted. This is why an empath feels both drawn and repelled. The pull is the wound seeking resolution. The repulsion is the adult self recognizing the danger. And in 2026, the unconscious demands resolution. This is the turning point. For the first time, the empath begins to see the narcissist not as a tyrant, but as an archetype. The wounded king, the false son, the mirror of the mother's gaze, the father who could not see. And once the narcissist becomes an archetype, they lose their power. Archetypes reveal patterns, and patterns reveal truth, and truth liberates. Once you see the narcissist as the symbolic return of your childhood wound, you no longer respond from childhood. You respond from awareness. You respond from adulthood. You respond from sovereignty. This is the moment when the empath stops trying to heal, fix, or understand the narcissist. Instead, they look inward and ask, what part of me still believes I must earn love? And this question, simple as it seems, begins to unravel the entire dynamic, because the narcissist never held the power. The power was always in the wound. And once the wound is understood, it dissolves, the spell breaks, the cycle ends. Yet it is not an easy process, for to recognize the narcissist as a reflection is to acknowledge that your childhood wound was deeper than you ever allowed yourself to admit. It means acknowledging that your sensitivity, your empathy, your healing nature, all the qualities you cherish were born from the absence of something you needed and never received. And such realization is a grief that shakes the soul, but it is also the beginning of freedom. And now, as we move deeper into this exploration, I want you to imagine a moment from your childhood, not a factual memory, but an emotional one. A moment when you wished to be seen, held, understood. A moment when your inner world was rich and alive, yet no one around you knew how to enter it. That moment created the empath. That moment created the gateway through which the narcissist would later walk. But 2026 is the year when that gate finally closes. Not through force, but through awareness. Not through resentment, but through realization, because the empath who sees the narcissist clearly is no longer the child who was wounded. They are the adult stepping into wholeness. And when that happens, everything begins to change. And so, my friends, let us continue in this deeper movement of recognition, for the path of the empath in 2026 is not a path outward, but inward. Not a quest to understand others, but a long-awaited return to the forgotten chambers of the self. The empath's awakening is not the rising of a new identity, but the remembering of an ancient one. The identity that existed before the wound was carved, before the psyche learned to bend itself toward the needs of those who could not offer the same in return. And what I wish for you to feel, not merely comprehend, is that this turning point emerges not from triumph, but from exhaustion. The exhaustion of repeating the same archetypal story year after year, decade after decade, believing that if you love enough, give enough, understand enough, you will finally be chosen, finally be seen, finally be valued. But the unconscious does not work this way. It does not reward self-sacrifice. It reveals illusion. It does not validate the false story. It shatters it, so the true story may rise. The empath who awakens in 2026 does so not because they discovered new strength, but because the old patterns broke under their own weight. The psyche can sustain distortion only for so long before it demands realignment. And the presence of the narcissist acts as a catalyst for this realignment. Not through healing, but through rupture, through disillusionment, through the painful clarity that the dynamic was never love, it was repetition. Imagine, if you will, a dream in which you walk through a house that feels familiar yet slightly distorted. Each room is a memory, though not as it truly happened, rather as the psyche encoded it. You notice a figure sitting in a dimly lit corner, barely illuminated by the flicker of a candle. You cannot see their face fully, yet you feel drawn to them, compelled to approach. As you inch closer, the figure lifts their head, and for a moment you believe it is someone from your adult life, a lover, a friend, a partner, but then the light shifts and you recognize the eyes of a parent. This dream encapsulates the core of the empath's entanglement. The people you meet later in life become symbolic stand-ins for what was left unfinished in childhood. And the narcissist is perhaps the most potent symbol the unconscious can summon. For the narcissist reflects not merely your unmet needs, but the very environment in which you first learned to silence your needs. They reflect the chaos of emotional unpredictability, the instability of parental attention, the subtle or overt message that your feelings were too much or not enough. And like the child you once were, you respond by giving more, explaining more, soothing more, absorbing more. But the empath's awakening occurs when the psyche no longer tolerates this inversion of energy. What 2026 symbolizes is the year when the unconscious becomes loud enough to override the survival patterns that once protected you. And this loudness often appears in the form of intense dreams, emotional breakdowns, sudden clarity, or a deep sense that you can no longer continue as you have been. The old self, the version of you built from wounds, begins to dissolve, and the true self begins to rise from beneath it. This is why the empath suddenly sees the narcissist differently. They are no longer enchanted by their charm, nor compelled by their woundedness. Instead, the empath sees the architecture of the dynamic with clarity, the push and pull, the idealization and devaluation, the cycle of hope and despair, and most importantly, they see that the cycle mirrors a deeper psychological structure from childhood. The narcissist becomes not a lover, but a symbol, not a partner, but an archetype. In Jungian terms, they embody the shadow parent, the figure who failed to mirror your emotional reality. And once the narcissist is recognized as such, the spell breaks, not because the narcissist becomes harmless, but because the empath finally steps out of the archetype that bound them. This stepping out process is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of remembrance. Remembering who you were before you became the caretaker, the peacemaker, the empathic interpreter of everyone else's pain. It is remembering the self that existed before you shaped yourself around others. And this older self, the true self, is far less fragile than you imagine. It does not need a narcissist's validation because it no longer identifies with the wound that sought that validation. And now let us speak of symbols, for symbols are the language of the unconscious. In many cultures, the turning point in a hero's journey occurs when they realize the monster they fear is a distorted projection of their own inner conflict. This is not literal, but psychological. The hero's fear externalizes as a creature, so they may confront what they could not face within themselves. In the empath's journey, the narcissist is precisely such a creature, not a monster, but an externalization of the unresolved wound that shaped the empath's identity. And the year 2026 functions as a moment when the hero sees the truth. The creature was never the enemy, the fear was, the wound was, the dissociation was. In dreams, one often encounters a hallway that stretches impossibly long, filled with doors that lead to forgotten aspects of the self. Behind one particular door lies a small version of yourself, sitting alone, waiting. They do not speak, they simply wait for you. This forgotten child is not weak, they are frozen. They hold the original wound, they hold the truth of what you needed and never received. And when the empath meets the narcissist in adulthood, it is this forgotten child who reacts, not the adult self. This is why the pain feels disproportionate, why the longing feels ancient, why the fear of abandonment feels catastrophic. It is not the present self reacting, it is the original wound that awakens in the presence of the archetype. But 2026 is the year when the child within stops believing the narcissist is parent-like in power. It is the year when the empath enters that dream hallway, opens the door, and finally takes the child's hand. And when that happens, the power of the narcissist collapses, not because the narcissist changes, but because the internal architecture that gave them power dissolves. You see, the narcissist's power was always borrowed from your wound, your longing, your childhood fear of being unseen. And when you reclaim the wound, you reclaim the power. Now, let us consider the archetype of the mirror. In the ancient world, the mirror was not merely a reflective surface. It was believed to show the soul. When an empath stares into the narcissist, they often see both the light and the darkness of themselves. The light is their compassion, their insight, their emotional intuition. The darkness is their forgotten pain, their unmet needs, their suppressed fear. The narcissist, unable to face their own shadow, projects it outward. The empath, conditioned to absorb shadows, internalizes it. But the year 2026 brings a shift where the mirror reverses direction. The empath begins to project their own consciousness outward rather than absorbing the projections of others. They begin to see the narcissist not as a reflection of who they are, but as a reflection of who they were trained to be. And this distinction is the soul's emancipation in dream work. This shift appears as a dream where the mirror no longer distorts the image. The reflection becomes aligned. The face you see is your own. And once you recognize yourself clearly, you no longer mistake the narcissist's image for truth. This is why I say 2026 is a turning point. It is the year of recognition, of psychological alignment, of the soul returning to its rightful orientation. And in this process, the empath does not become hardened or cynical. They become discerning. They learn the sacred difference between compassion and self-betrayal. They learn that empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. They learn that healing others cannot repair the wound within. They learn that their childhood longing cannot be resolved through adult relationships that mirror the same absence. The awakening of the empath is not the awakening of anger. It is the awakening of vision. And once vision is awakened, the pattern cannot continue. Fate changes. The psyche reorganizes. The cycle ends not with punishment but with realization. You cannot unsee what the unconscious has revealed. And so in 2026, the empath steps into a new psychological position. They no longer approach relationships from the wound, but from awareness. They no longer accept emotional inconsistency as normal. They no longer interpret the narcissist's neediness as love or their instability as passion. They see with the eyes of the self that has returned. In this state, the empath feels something they have rarely felt before: neutrality. Not indifference, but neutrality, the absence of the old emotional charge. The narcissist may still attempt the same patterns, but the empath does not respond in the same way. The spell dissolves, and this dissolution marks the true end of the dynamic, because the narcissist cannot survive psychologically in a space where their projections no longer land. The empath's neutrality is liberation, and liberation is the true theme of 2026. Let us go deeper now. For the moment of awakening I speak of does not arrive with thunder, nor does it announce itself as revelation. It comes quietly, like a shift in the atmosphere, like the subtle change in temperature before dawn. The empath often senses it before they understand it. They begin to feel disconnected from the emotional storms that once consumed them. They notice that the manipulations, the silent treatments, the cycles of idealization and devaluation no longer strike the same wound within. And this is not numbness, it is emergence. It is the psyche rising from the place where it once lay prostrate before the wounded patterns of childhood. For so long, the empath's identity was intertwined with the role of the healer, not because they truly desired it, but because the child they once were had no other choice. To survive emotionally in a household where their needs were not mirrored, they learned to become the mirror. They learned to anticipate the moods of caregivers, to soothe, to adapt, to absorb. This adaptive brilliance becomes what we call empathy, an exquisite sensitivity to the psyche of others. But one must remember, the gift is born from necessity, And necessity is born from lack. So when the empath meets the narcissist, the inner child recognizes the familiar terrain, the unpredictability of affection, the instability of attention, the hunger for validation that never ends. These are conditions. The empath already learned to navigate in childhood. The adult may believe they are drawn by love or intensity or charisma, but the unconscious knows otherwise. The unconscious seeks resolution through repetition. What was not completed must be reenacted. What was not healed must be confronted. And the narcissist embodies the original wound with uncanny precision. Yet in 2026, a shift occurs. The empath begins to see that the pull they feel is not the pull of destiny, but the pull of memory. And memory, once recognized, loses its power to dictate the future. Consider the mythic pattern of the hero who returns to the underworld. They enter not to retrieve a treasure or defeat a monster, but to reclaim a part of themselves lost long ago. The narcissist is the threshold guardian of this underworld, a symbolic figure who forces the empath to confront the unhealed part of the psyche. But once the empath retrieves their wholeness, the guardian's power dissolves. The underworld becomes merely a place visited, not a place lived in. To illustrate this inner shift, imagine a dream. You stand on the edge of a vast lake at night. The surface is dark, reflective, and still. You lean over, expecting to see your reflection, but instead you see the face of a parent whose gaze once shaped your emotional world. You step back in fear, but when you look again, the reflection shifts. It becomes the face of the narcissist you loved in adulthood. Then, suddenly, the water ripples and the face becomes your own. The shifting reflection symbolizes the truth that the empath's relationships are mirrors, layered upon mirrors. The face you feared was never theirs. It was always the wound trying to show itself. And this is the awakening of 2026. The empath finally sees the water clearly. They recognize that the narcissist's emotional hunger was never theirs to satisfy. They recognize that the longing they felt did not belong to the present. It belonged to the child still waiting to be seen. And once this recognition dawns, the empath can no longer engage in the same dynamics, not because they are angry, but because the illusion is gone. The unconscious does not allow one to continue participating in a story once its symbolism is revealed. Awareness transforms fate into choice. Much of the empath's suffering comes from confusing their wounds with their identity. They believe their sensitivity, their compassion, their ability to feel deeply are inherent traits, and indeed, these qualities exist within them, but the compulsive drive to heal others, to fix dysfunction, to remain loyal to those who harm them. This is not identity. This is wound. And the wound is not the truth of who they are. It is the adaptation they made to survive. Thus, when 2026 brings its psychological tide, it washes away the false identity formed through childhood. This washing is not violent. It is gradual, inevitable, like the way a river wears down stone. The empath begins to realize that their boundaries were never unkindness, but self-regulation. Their distance was not abandonment, but protection. Their refusal to engage in chaos was not coldness, but clarity. And this clarity, once awakened, introduces the empath to an emotion they rarely allow themselves to feel: anger. But not the destructive, reactive anger of the narcissist. No, the empath's anger is an awakening, a recognition that something precious within them was violated long ago. It is the anger of the self returning, and this sacred anger is not a weapon, it is a boundary. It is the force that turns the empath away from self-sacrifice and toward self-restoration. The narcissist senses this shift immediately. They sense it not with consciousness, but with instinct. The moment the empath begins to awaken, the narcissist feels the ground beneath the dynamic tremble. For the narcissist depends entirely on the empath's unconscious wound. Without it, the cycle collapses. This collapse is often met with attempts to reassert control, idealization, guilt, rage, silence, seduction, projection. But none of it lands the way it once did, because the empath is no longer standing in the wound, they are standing in awareness. Awareness is invulnerability. Let us dwell for a moment on the archetype of the wounded parent. In many psyches, the parental figure is not remembered as they truly were, but as the child perceived them. A parent may have been distracted, overwhelmed, emotionally unavailable, or self-absorbed, not malicious, but limited, and the child interprets these limitations as personal failures. The child internalizes the belief, if I were enough, they would have seen me. This belief crystallizes into a core wound. The narcissist later becomes the adult reenactment of this wound. The same conditional affection, the same emotional unpredictability, the same sense of being, both wanted and dismissed. But in 2026, the empath sees the truth. The wound was never their fault. It was never their responsibility. And when this truth sinks into the deepest layer of the psyche, the entire architecture of their relational patterns shifts. The empath stops trying to earn what should be given freely. They stop blaming themselves for the emotional deficits of others. They stop interpreting emotional distance as a sign of inadequacy. They stop contorting themselves to fit the unpredictable needs of those who cannot love with depth. This shift is not intellectual, it is embodied. It shows up in the tone of the voice, the posture, the breathing. It shows up in the way the empath says no without guilt, in the way they walk away without returning, in the way they choose peace over chaos, truth over fantasy, clarity over yearning. But perhaps The deepest transformation occurs in the dream realm, for when the unconscious reorganizes itself, dreams change their language. The empath begins to dream of open doors instead of locked ones, of clear skies instead of storms, of standing upright instead of kneeling. They may dream of returning to their childhood home, but finding it empty. This emptiness is healing. It means the psyche has stopped living there. It means the inner child has finally left the place where they waited for someone to return who never could. And when the inner child leaves that house, the empath stops choosing relationships that resemble it. Let us also speak of the shadow. For no true psychological awakening can occur without confronting it. The empath's shadow is not anger, nor coldness, nor indifference. Though these may appear as defenses, the true shadow of the empath is need, the need to be seen, understood, chosen, the need to matter, the need to be loved without condition. This need is not weakness, it is humanity. But the empath learned early to suppress it. They learned to hide it beneath compassion, to bury it beneath caretaking, to disguise it as selflessness. The narcissist, however, awakens this need with surgical precision, not because they love the empath, but because they reflect the very wound that gave birth to the need. This is why the dynamic feels so intense, because the narcissist does not touch the adult, they touch the child, and the child responds with desperation. But in 2026, the empath finally confronts their shadow with tenderness instead of shame. They look at the buried need and say, I see you. They acknowledge their longing without collapsing into it. They no longer seek its fulfillment in those who cannot provide it. They become the parent to their own need. And this act of internal reparenting is the true liberation. Once the empath's shadow is integrated, the narcissist loses their archetypal hold. They become simply a person flawed, wounded, and limited, not a symbol of salvation or destruction. And when someone becomes human in your mind, you no longer need to save them or fear them. You simply release them. Release is the theme of the Empath 2026. Not escape, not revenge, not triumph. Release. The kind of release that feels like exhaling after holding your breath for years. The kind of release that comes when the psyche no longer needs the dynamic to understand itself. The kind of release that marks the end of a karmic cycle, the end of unconscious repetition. And when the empath releases the narcissist, they also release the version of themselves that bonded through pain. In that moment, something extraordinary happens. The empath meets themselves for the first time. Not the caretaker, not the healer, not the forgiver, not the mirror, but the self beneath all those layers, the self who existed long before the wound, the self who carries wisdom not born of suffering but of essence. This meeting is the true turning point. It is the moment the empath steps out of fate and into destiny. And now, as we draw the circle to its completion, let us explore the final movement of this profound transformation. For the empath's awakening in 2026 is not merely a psychological shift, but a symbolic rebirth, one that touches the deepest layers of the soul. The moment you recognize that the narcissist was never the source of your suffering, but the mirror that revealed it, an extraordinary quietness settles into your being, a quietness that feels like clarity, like truth, like the dissolving of illusions that have governed your inner world for far too long. When one awakens from a long dream, even a dream filled with pain, there is a moment of disorientation, a moment when the psyche recalibrates itself. The empath experiences something similar. They begin to see life not through the lens of wounded identity, but through the lens of the self that has always existed beneath it. They recognize how much of their adult life was lived in the echo of childhood, how many choices were shaped not by desire, but by unconscious repetition. How many relationships were attempts to repair what was never their fault. And in that recognition, the empath stands on a threshold. They once feared the threshold of individuality. This is where the true transformation unfolds, the moment when the empath releases the illusion that their worth is tied to their usefulness to others. For so long, they carried the unconscious belief that love must be earned, that presence must be justified, that belonging must be negotiated. But when the wound is finally seen, really seen, the belief loses its structure. The psyche no longer bends toward people who cannot hold emotional reality. The empath stops searching for the parent in the partner. They stop seeking healing through reenactment. They stop mistaking longing for compatibility. And in this newfound clarity, something remarkable emerges. The empath begins to sense their own energy for the first time. It is as if the soul has been speaking in a whisper for decades, and suddenly the volume rises. The empath hears themselves. They feel the weight of their own essence, the richness of their intuition, the depth of their inner world. They notice how their body responds to truth versus distortion. They feel the difference between love and trauma, and most importantly, they no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety. For the empath, this is nothing short of a revelation. Imagine, if you will, a dream in which you walk through a forest at dusk. The trees tower above you, ancient and watchful, their branches forming a canopy that filters the fading light. You come upon a river that glows with its own luminance, a river that seems alive. As you kneel beside it, you see your reflection not distorted, not fractured, but unified. Behind your reflection stands the child you once were. And behind that child, the parent whose gaze once shaped your emotional world. And behind them, the figure of the narcissist who entered your adulthood. But this time, all these reflections align, forming a single image, your own. This is the symbolic moment wherein the empath realizes that every figure who wounded them was part of a lineage of mirrors, each one reflecting a different angle of the same inner truth. And when these reflections merge, the empath no longer feels pulled in multiple directions. They feel centered. They feel whole. They feel sovereign. Sovereignty is the true destination of the empath's journey. It is not a hardened independence, nor a cold emotional detachment. It is the recognition that your energy is your own. Your emotions are your own. Your life is your own. And when you belong to yourself, you no longer magnetize those who seek to feed on what you do not protect. The narcissist begins to fade from the empath's life in an almost surreal way, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. What once captivated the empath now feels hollow. What once triggered them now feels distant. What once pulled them back now holds no gravity. The cycle ends when the wound no longer resonates with the archetype, and once the resonance dissolves, the narcissist becomes simply a person, no longer a symbol, no longer a mirror, no longer a source of emotional meaning. And this fading is painful only for a moment, because after the fading comes expansion. The empath feels a growing spaciousness inside themselves, a sense of internal roominess, as if their psyche has been uncluttered after years of being filled with other people's projections. They begin to dream differently. They begin to walk differently. They begin to inhabit their own skin with a quiet confidence that feels both ancient and new. This confidence is not bravado. It is the natural state of a psyche no longer weighed down by unconscious repetition. In the language of symbols, 2026 marks the rise of the inner sun. The empath's light no longer radiates outward indiscriminately. It illuminates from within. It warms their own interior world. It nurtures the parts of them that were too long neglected. It calls back the fragments of the self that dissociated in childhood. And as these fragments return, the empath becomes whole, not perfect, not invulnerable, but whole. Wholeness changes everything. A whole person does not chase love, they allow it. A whole person does not fear abandonment, they understand it. A whole person does not seek validation, they generate it. A whole person does not cling, they discern. A whole person does not collapse, they choose. And in this wholeness, the empath encounters a profound realization. They were never meant to live their life as a reaction to others. They were never meant to heal everyone who crossed their path. They were never meant to sacrifice their inner truth for external harmony. They were meant to embody the full depth of their psyche, to integrate light and shadow, childhood and adulthood, wound and wisdom. The true empath is not the fragile healer society imagines. The true empath is a psychic warrior, one who can walk through the darkness of the unconscious and return with truth, one who can see through the illusions others cannot face, one who can feel what others repress, one who can recognize archetypes at play in ordinary relational dynamics, one who holds an ancient sensitivity that was never meant to be exploited but honored. But this warrior only emerges when the wound no longer defines them. And this is the gift of 2026. The empath becomes their own healer. Let us speak of the final dream, the dream that marks the end of the cycle. It often arrives at an unexpected time, a dream where the empath sees a house they once lived in. The rooms are empty. The walls echo with quiet. The windows are open. And as the empath walks through this dream house, they realize something profound. No one else is there. Not the parent who wounded them. Not the narcissist who mirrored that wound. Not the ghosts of old memories. The house is empty because the psyche has moved on. The soul has vacated the place of pain. And in the final image of this dream, the empath walks out of the house and closes the door behind them, not with force, not with regret, but with completion. Completion is the healing that trauma never allowed. When the empath steps into the world after this inner closure, they are no longer the same person. They begin to attract relationships that resonate with who they have become, not who they once were. They attract depth instead of drama, reciprocity instead of extraction, presence instead of performance. They attract people who can meet them in the inner space they once denied themselves, and in these relationships, the empath's sensitivity becomes a strength, not a vulnerability. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation is this. The empath no longer fears their own depth. They no longer dim themselves to maintain harmony. They no longer shrink to avoid threatening fragile egos. They no longer bend under the weight of emotional responsibility that does not belong to them. They stand in their truth with a quiet courage that feels like destiny. Destiny is what emerges when the unconscious becomes conscious. And in 2026, this emergence becomes unavoidable. The tide of awakening touches every empath who has carried the weight of generational patterns, childhood wounds, and the projections of those who could not see them clearly. This is not merely personal healing, it is archetypal healing. It is the psyche's movement toward individuation, the process of becoming one's true, unfragmented self. And as you step into this individuation, you will notice something remarkable. The world responds differently to you, not because the world has changed, but because your perception has. The narcissist loses their captivating power because you no longer perceive them as the missing piece. You no longer see them through the eyes of the child. You see them through the eyes of the self, and the self does not chase illusion. And so, as we close this journey, I invite you to breathe into the truth of what you have discovered. You are not the wound, you are the awareness that sees the wound. You are not the empathy that exhausts itself. You are the consciousness that directs it. You are not defined by who hurt you. You are defined by who you become when you see the truth. In this sense, 2026 is not a year. It is a portal, a passage into a deeper life, a life where your empathy is not your burden, but your gift, a life where your boundaries are not walls, but expressions of self-respect, a life where your sensitivity is not exploited but honored. A life where your childhood wound no longer writes your story. A life where you finally become the person you were always meant to be. And perhaps in the silence of your own soul, you can feel it even now. The turning point is already within you.